Good morning, it's Mrs. Reed here, and welcome to Lesson 4, where we are exploring media representations. Today's focus is on Paul Gilroy and a study of his post-colonial theory. You can see that this is part of our current sequence, working through our representation theorists, where we're applying them to news media and looking at a range of other case study texts too. You can see I've changed the order ever so slightly from last week. We've covered already stereotypes, ideologies, looked at Hall's theory. Today we're going to look at Gilroy, and then on Friday we'll be moving on to explore Gauntlet's ideas of identity. So let's recap Hall to begin with. I've produced for you a cloze exercise here. So what I would like you to do is to pause the video, to write out the sentences in full, and to fill in the gaps. Can you do that now, please? Okay, let's go through the answers. You can mark them and edit and change if you need to. So it should read like this, that Stuart Hall is a cultural theorist who considers how representations are constructed and the way in which audiences respond to them. Hall argues that media products do not offer us a reflection of the real world, but rather produce versions of reality. Hall suggests audiences have largely internalized this shared symbolic code through their media experiences. And finally, Hall suggests that the use of stereotypes infer a type of social power, helping to present some groups as outcasts or social others. Okay, so if you need to go back and recap any of Hall's theories, remember that the session from last lesson is the one to look to. Today though, we're going to explore Paul Gilroy's theory, and this in some way can be linked to that of Hall's, particularly where he looks at the construction of a racial otherness within print media. Gilroy looks at newspapers in the 1970s and the 80s, and in a similar way to Hall, he argues that criminal representation of black males regularly stigmatise the black community. He also explores media through the 90s, looking at the way in which British identity is constructed, and he draws attention to this idea of a post-colonial melancholia. What he says is the media's response to the UK's declining global position. He says this loss of post-war empire is evident in the representations of a nostalgia for Britain's past, perhaps demonstrated through repeated imagery and iconography such as the Union Jack. He looks at this issue as being problematic, in part because it includes a racial misrepresentation, and also it fuels this idea of a multicultural disharmony. So throughout this lesson we are going to explore some of the key terms associated with Gilroy's ideas, and I would like you to use the e-worksheet that's attached on Show My Homework. So this is from the excellent resources provided by Mark Dixon on his Essential Media Theory website, and you can see that I'm using his book here to work through those concepts. So it's going to be really useful to either complete that e-worksheet as you go through the video, or perhaps make your notes and then complete the worksheet tasks at the end. So we'll be looking at 4 terms: racial otherness, civilizationist, and civilizationism. So we'll want to be able to use those 4 terms when writing about Gilroy's theory. Let's start with the idea of a racial otherness, and this is really important because Gilroy studies black representation. Lots of these ideas can be seen in his work that he published called There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, And this really traces the idea of UK race relations from the Second World War onwards. He's interested in the immigration of people from the West Indies and how this produced anxieties about immigrant behaviour. He draws people's attention to newspaper reports that represented immigration as something to be worried about and fearful of. Stories that focused on black pimps and sordid sexuality, violent crime, as well as a fear that immigrant communities might swamp white Britain. And he says this constructing then of the racial other is predominantly constructing them as a racial other in the predominantly white world of 1950s Britain. So he's saying that these perceptions of immigrants as some kind of a challenge to white Western culture are really evident through media representations. It's presented almost in a way that says, blackness and criminality are this kind of common sense feature of the media, he suggests. So we see those fears in this news coverage that routinely associates black communities with assaults, with muggings, with forms of violent crime. And this is obviously hugely problematic. He also looks at the way that news stories are shaped to link in with this racial otherness. So he says that the othering has, another strand to it. He uses the example of the Notting Hill Carnival, a riot that happened there in 1976. And he says that despite this being multi-ethnic, this carnival, that the focus in the media was very much on angry black youths, coloured men screaming in groups. So again, really sensationalising and othering one particular a group of people. He says then that this further fuels anxieties, and it also means that some of the other concerns, the political concerns of the black community, who are concerned about the heavy-handed police tactics that are being used, these issues go largely ignored because of the media's focus on this criminal behaviour. And another example that's evident in Dixon's book, taken from Gilroy, is this representation of white males in the Daily Mail in 1982. And they focus on this story of several Eton pupils. They are detained and charged on drug offences. And in the reporting of this, it's claimed that their descent into criminality was prompted by Rastafarian influences. So that even something that is completely separate, we're talking about privately educated upper-class schoolboys, are in some way being presented through the lens of black criminality. But there is this kind of a racial binary that challenges what Gilroy says. It challenges ideas of white civility. The idea is constructed through the media that white civility is corrupted by the influence of a black other. So this othering takes many forms. So in summary, his ideas here about othering and racial othering are that Second World War immigrants were viewed as alien and other to an imagined white Britishness, that black immigrants were perceived to be swamping white communities. Now that word choice there, swamping, is important because it's something that still persists, this idea that any form of immigration, whether it is through, let's look at a representation of refugees, for example, people seeking refuge and shelter, this idea that they're in some way going to overtake in an uncontrolled manner, this kind of language still persists. Gilroy suggests then that black communities were demonised through these representations that associated them with acts of criminality, and also that the black otherness, it was claimed by the media, had some kind of a corrosive effect on white culture. Okay, now I know there are a few tasks actually on the worksheet that I've attached, linked to those ideas, so you may wish to pause the video at this point and complete those tasks. Okay, the second part of his theory then, we're going to focus on this idea of civilizationism. And Gilroy suggests that there is a significant event that really changes the tone of media representations around race. And he identifies this moment of that at 9/11, the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center back in 2001. And he says the aftermath of this really helps to shape the way that the media represents race. So one of the things that Gilroy makes reference to is George Bush's State of the Union address. In this speech, he declared that North Korea, Iran and Iraq were an axis of evil, arming to threaten world peace. And he identifies this as a key moment in this kind of shift in representation. Now, why is this important? Well, not only is it right, as Gilroy points out, a deeply troubling kind of imperialist view of global politics, but it would also allow for justification of foreign intervention in global kind of conflict on the grounds that Western democracy are in some way morally superior. So this is another version of that othering, placing Western nations in opposition to any other nation in the world. And what Gilroy noted is that the media accepted this view and repeated Bush's claim this axis of evil worldview is replicated through newspaper reporting. And he labels these post 9/11 representations as civilizationism. Okay, let's explore a little bit more about what he means by that. A good example to look at here for this would be the reporting of one news event. So one of the ways to look at it, again thanks to Mark Dixon for suggesting this, one of the ways to look at it would be through the way in which Western audiences are positioned and the contrast between them and Islamic fundamentalism. And this is evident not just in news, but in television dramas and other media texts too. So it's worthwhile looking at this news story. So to give you a little bit of the background here, this was the reporting of news story around Shamima Begum. This is a young lady who was radicalised, who went to join the Islamic State in the UK as a teenager, and she is, I think, pregnant at this time and wanting to return to the UK. Now, the reporting of this, Dixon frames in this way, can be seen really in this idea that the binary that's presented is that there is some kind of battle between the Muslim fundamentalism and the Western democratic ideals. So what we're seeing within this is a construction of the idea that there is a Muslim incompatibility with UK culture. And this is foregrounded in the girl's lack of repentance, a seeming unwillingness to, reintegrate into the UK, And again, the Daily Mail kind of emphasises like this kind of swarming potential of the story. You know, the UK may be forced, they say, to repatriate further girls if they go ahead with this. So there's this kind of lack of sympathy. It's evident not just in the headlines you see here, but also in the Sun as well. The headline being sympathy. You must be kidding. And what we get instead is this sensationalism, this exaggerated sense of fear, the othering of this young lady as a source of danger, and not just her being representative of a wider culture and belief system. The kind of lack of sympathy of the public is kind of identified. The imagery itself represents this. You know, the black-clad hijab-wearing women nursing the baby. This is supposed to construct a deliberately kind of unsettling idea of Muslim motherhood. So it's worthwhile questioning when we're looking at a news story, you know, how do these representations really try to nurture fear within the audience? Do they deliberately dehumanize extremist subjects? We might want to think about why. Is there construction of a racial hierarchy? Or perhaps does it work in the opposite way? Does it deconstruct these, you know, civilizationist ideas and assumptions? So let's go through in a bit more detail really what Gilroy means by this. So he says that civilizationism constructs a binary worldview, okay, and Dixon refers to Bush here again. You're either with us or you're you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. That binary opposition. There is no area in between for nuance and consideration of what might be happening here. So this stark worldview, it positions the audiences then to internalize this binary that divides the globe into opposing forces, yeah? The opposing forces of terrorists and a morally superior West. He says that these attitudes have a racist subtext. So for Gilroy, he says that the war on terror rhetoric of post 9/11 just further fuels and perpetuates a long-standing racial hierarchy in which Muslim subjects are positioned as inferior. He argues that it nurtures a cultural incompatibility. So where the media focus so much on global conflicts and terrorist action, there's an inference that European and Muslim groups are incompatible communities. So Gilroy reminds us that this inference is in fact a media fabrication, is a construction. He says, racially diverse communities live with very few, if any, day-to-day effects of racial difference. But the over-representation and focus on this in the media starts to shift our view away from the reality of it. And finally, as we may suspect from many newspaper reports, it nurtures a fear. So for Gilroy, you know, the consequences of this civilizationism are about the construction, securiocracy. So this is the use of repressive measures by Western democracies designed to keep nation-states terrorist-free. So an example of this might be the inhumane treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, for example, and the torture of terrorist suspects as justified as a necessary measure. Okay, I know there's, again, space on your sheet to be developing notes on this viewpoint. So I'd like you to go through and make sure that you've updated that. And there are some texts on there that I want you to look at in more depth. So this one actually appears on the e-worksheet. So I would like you to finish up with a bit of application. So I want you to start with a brief summary. So what does Gilroy suggest according to Gilroy's theories of what? What do media representations do or focus on? Can you refer to this front cover of the Sun, please? What can we see evident here? I mean, I've given you space for 2 things. You can obviously develop and build on that. So how are these media representations constructed, and how might they then play into this civilizationalist or othering kind of attitude? Where can they be seen? Okay, so that brings us to the end of this part of the lesson. Please make sure that you have used the worksheet, that you have a go at applying, and then you send over to me a copy of your work. Okay, thank you.